The Orioles are continuing to add depth on the position player side. This time, it is Luis Vazquez coming over from the Chicago Cubs. Tell you all about him coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Monday, February 3rd, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to run through some Orioles news and notes as the O's made a minor trade acquiring infielder Luis Vazquez from the Chicago Cubs. Talk about him, his scouting report, and what he brings to the organization. Then we'll chat a bit about Emanuel Rivera, who was DFA'd by the Orioles to make room for Vázquez on the 40-man, what his future looks like potentially in Baltimore after his strong finish to the 2024 season when the O's brought him in on waivers. And then finally, we'll talk about Jorge Mateo. I had mentioned with the Orioles signing Dylan Carlson last week that I felt like Mateo's roster spot was a little more on the hot seat. Well, the Orioles finally agreed to an arbitration number with him and added a club option for Mateo for the 2026 season, and that could mean some different things for his future with the O's. But we'll get to all that and more coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Just download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started today. So we're going to run through the Orioles news and notes since I last talked with you on Wednesday, and we begin with Luis Vazquez, 25-year-old infielder who the Orioles acquired from the Chicago Cubs in exchange for cash considerations in a trade back on Friday. Now, Vázquez is technically a trade acquisition. It's essentially a glorified waiver claim. Vázquez was DFA'd by the Chicago Cubs last week, and the Orioles, we've seen them do this with multiple players who were on waivers that the Orioles wanted, but with the O's having such a good record last year, they're fairly low on the waiver wire. So 20-plus Major League Baseball teams have a chance to claim a player like Vázquez before the Orioles do. But when you designate a player for assignment, like the Cubs did with Vázquez last week, you have a 5-day period where you can actually trade him to another team before officially placing him on those full waivers. So the Orioles utilized that time to jump ahead of the waiver order, basically say to the Cubs, hey, we will offer you money just to trade us Vázquez and not put him on waivers. Cubs didn't get a better offer. They said yes, and Luis Vázquez is now a member of the Baltimore Orioles. Now let's talk about who is Luis Vazquez, 25-year-old right-handed hitting infielder who was the Cubs' 14th round pick out of high school in Puerto Rico back in the 2017 MLB draft. And he has climbed his way through the minor leagues and finally made his major league debut in the 2024 season. Now, barely got any time on the field. He appeared in 11 games for the Cubs, starting only 3 of them down the stretch. So it was just 14 big league plate appearances for Vázquez at age 24 in the 2024 season. Not a very big sample size. He went 1 for 14 with a single, an RBI, 2 runs scored, 6 strikeouts, no walks. He had a hit by pitch. He had a sac fly. He did a few things. Again, he went to the plate 14 times. He played in 11 games. It was a little taste of the big leagues basically last September for Vázquez with the Cubs. His first and only hit was actually a bunt single in September, so he still hasn't had a full swinging hit, you could say, in the major leagues. But Vázquez was actually called up in May of last year, debuted in 1 game for the Cubs. Then they sent him back down and did not recall him until late August. He was essentially a September call-up. He was a bench player down the stretch, made 3 starts at the end of the year, but was mostly coming off of the Cubs bench. Now, his journey through the Cubs minor league system, he started playing after he was drafted, after the 2017 draft. He was 18 years old, and he started building his way up through the Chicago system, and he was a pretty impressive fast mover through the system. Now, some of it was the Cubs needed players. He did get a small taste of AAA in the 2019 season at age 19. But in 2021, when things came back, you saw him in AA. 2022, he really truly reached AAA at the end of that season after a so-so run in AA that year. But he's had solid seasons in 2023 and 24 in the minor leagues. 2023, he kind of split between AA and AAA, spent more time in AAA. And then the entire 2024 season, he was with the Iowa Cubs. That is the AAA affiliate of the Chicago Cubs. And he was all right last year. He had a 104 WRC plus, so he was an above average hitter at the AAA level. He had 273 plate appearances in AAA. He hit 263, 347, 432, 8 home runs, 9% walk rate, 22% strikeout rate on the season. Kind of showed that he was at least a solid AAA level player. Now, at the AAA level last year, he had a 38% hard hit rate. That would be below average in the major leagues, about 40th percentile, kind of evens up with somebody like Joey Ortiz, if you think about the former Oriole and how hard he hits the ball. But some of the other data looks a little bit better, like 6% barrel rate is not terrible. And his max exit velocity, 111.5 miles per hour, that would put him in the 77th percentile in the majors. He's in the ball harder when he hits it as hard as he can, harder than 3/4 of MLB players. And to put a comparison in, a 111.5 max exit velocity, that is equal to, guess what, Joey Ortiz in 2024. Now, Vázquez did kind of struggle against fastballs at times, but he hit breaking balls really, really well, both curveballs and sliders in AAA last year, and he finished the season incredibly strong. This is the part that gets you a little bit excited. In the final 2 months of his season, in August and September, he hit 289 with a 644 slugging percentage, a 43% hard hit rate, and an 11% barrel rate down the stretch in AAA. And that is really what got him that call up to the big leagues to sit on the bench and get a little bit of time in September for the Cubs last year. But he was just so good in those 2 months prior to the call up. Now, was he a prospect? Yeah, he was. Fangraphs ranked him the 35th best prospect in the Cubs system in their midseason 2024 most recent list. Eric Longenhagen over at Fangraphs gave him on the 20 to 80 scale a 30 for his hit tool, but 50 for his raw power, 50 for his run, and 45 for his fielding. Eric writes about how he kind of has a loopy swing, but he does show some power with that right-handed swing, and calls him a good but not great defender. However, if you read about Vázquez over at Baseball America, which also does a great job of covering prospects, and I prefer Fangraphs, Baseball America, a great resource as well, you can kind of see how different evaluators see players differently. And while Longenhagen had Vázquez ranked as the 35th best prospect in the Cubs system, Baseball America had him ranked 16th in the Cubs system. That is a large disparity for a prospect. And the reason why BA had him so much higher, Eric at Fangraphs basically is like, hey, this is a solid infield defender who can play multiple positions, but he's not really elite at any of those positions. Baseball America was like, Vázquez is the best defensive infielder in the Chicago Cubs system. They called him an elite defender in the middle infield, and that allows him to have a lot more play if the defense is that good. So we will find out, but he has played shortstop, second base, and third base in the minors and played all three positions in the majors in just those 11 games with the Cubs last season. So if the defense is as elite as BA says, and he still has this kind of intriguing bat from the right side, and he's by far played the most shortstop, like he is a true shortstop coming up through the minor leagues, he really does look like, with the equal exit velocity numbers and kind of that loopy swing and a good defender who can play multiple spots in the infield, he kind of looks to me, and from watching him play as well, he looks like a poor man's Joey Ortiz. Like Vázquez is obviously not the prospect Joey Ortiz was, but he looks like a very similar, again, a lesser version, but a similar kind of profile as Joey Ortiz, who of course the Orioles traded over to the Brewers in the Corbin Burnes deal just over a year ago, and a deal that has certainly worked out for both sides. But it's kind of intriguing to see the Orioles go and get a guy like this who does kind of model after Joey Ortiz. Now, obviously for Luis Vazquez, this is not a great roster fit right now. The Orioles are pretty heavy on position players. They have a really stacked infield right now, and Vázquez is not going to come in, even though he is placed on the 40-man roster, he's not going to come in and immediately get towards the front of the line for getting an infield spot. But what he does have is 2 minor league option years, which means if the Orioles keep him on the 40-man, they can simply send him down to AAA Norfolk to begin the season and not have to worry about losing him. I mean, he can become interesting prospect depth in AAA for the Orioles. And if the O's are jumping the waiver line and giving the Cubs money to go and get Vázquez, there's clearly something that they like here. Now, it doesn't mean he won't get DFA'd in a couple of weeks as part of the roster churn. You know, we just saw it with guys like Roansy Contreras, guys like Jacob Amaya that the Orioles have claimed and then DFA'd within the span of like a week or two, just a little bit earlier this offseason. And Vázquez could certainly be the next guy in that chain. But because they did something a little bit different and they jumped the line and he does have those options, I think it's a little more likely that Vázquez would stick on the 40-man roster throughout the offseason. Not saying it's going to happen, just saying it is a little bit more likely. And the Orioles, because he was not a waiver claim by the O's, down 25th on the waiver wire, he was a trade. The O's have no idea what would happen if they DFA'd Vázquez and they put him on waivers. It could be the fact that the White Sox really like him and they could claim him first and the Orioles could never get him back. They don't have that assurance of, hey, when we claimed him, 23 teams already said no to him. If we waive him, we just got to get him through the other 6 and then we can keep him in our organization. It's not the same when you do the cash trade for a player to avoid the waivers like Vázquez. So it's another reason why they may hold on to him for a little bit longer. Now, Emanuel Rivera was DFA'd to get Vázquez on this roster. We'll talk about kind of the comparisons now, but I like what the O's have done this offseason because they didn't have a lot of holes to fill offensively. Obviously, James McCann gone via free agency. Anthony Santander signs with the Blue Jays. The Orioles go and get Tyler O'Neill and Gary Sanchez to fill those roles on the roster. And we know they picked up Dylan Carlson last week, and he's kind of going to be a bubble opening day roster player. Could go either way, whether he starts the year with the Orioles or starts it in AAA Norfolk. But the rest of the guys they've brought in terms of hitters have been AAA depth because with all the prospect promotions the Orioles have made, and then with all the guys they have traded away in the past couple of years to improve their big league roster, that insane position player prospect depth that the Orioles have had in Norfolk for the past couple of years just doesn't exist anymore. And that's okay. You'd rather that talent be in the big leagues or helping you in the big leagues via trades. And that's what the O's have done. But it's depleted the specific AAA level of their prospects. So these are all the guys that they have either acquired this offseason or have already gotten previously, but will be in AAA as depth. These are just the guys who can play the infield for the Orioles in AAA Norfolk. And these are all guys who I could easily see if the Orioles needed a depth guy, they trust enough to call up to the big leagues. Luis Vazquez, of course, has the big league experience. Levon Soto played in the big leagues for the O's last year. Franklin Barreto, they brought in on a minor league deal. He's got big league experience. Vimael Machin, they brought in on a minor league deal. Also big league experience. Jordan Adams and Nick Gordon, they're kind of utility guys who play more outfield than infield at this point, but had been infielders at points in their career and have been big leaguers. Jeremiah Jackson, interesting former prospect they brought in. I mean, Kobe Mayo, at this point, looking at the roster, likely starts in AAA. And even at this point, Emanuel Rivera, who was DFA'd, could stay in the organization and be in AAA as well. They definitely have now added a crop of guys this offseason to fill in for the lack of depth down there. And they now have a lot of options to go to. It's not all the highest ceiling guys possible. And honestly, out of all those names I just mentioned, besides, of course, Kobe Mayo, I like Luis Vazquez the most. I think he has the best chance to actually play in the big leagues for the Orioles this season, but it's just about upgrading their depth. And that is what the Orioles did, specifically because of what the corresponding roster move was. The 40-man roster was full when the Orioles made this trade, so someone had to lose their spot, and that someone was Emanuel Rivera. We'll talk about why the O's made that move, despite his success with the O's last season. That is coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, and endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds to feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. And the live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, no matter how upset you are with the Kansas City Chiefs winning. And the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that is icing on the cake. So download the app or head to fanduel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's at fanduel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. So for the Orioles, they went out and got Luis Vazquez, kind of an interesting young infielder with options on a mini trade with the Cubs. But as I mentioned, the 40-man roster was full. They had to make a corresponding move, and that was Emanuel Rivera has been designated for assignment. Now, Rivera has really spent this entire offseason on the Orioles roster bubble, and it's something I've talked about multiple times when I did a ranking a couple of weeks back of kind of the next players that could get DFA'd. Rivera was number 2 on there. It didn't take long for his time to come, and Rivera is out of options. And Luis Vazquez, who they got, has 2 minor league options, and they are both defense-first, right-handed hitting infielders. So if you're looking to upgrade on the fringes on the roster, and you're looking at Rivera versus Vazquez, both guys who, if the season started right now, would not have a place on this Orioles opening day roster, Vazquez, you can just option to AAA, and you have roster flexibility. Rivera's out of options. You'd have to get DFA'd. You have to lose him at some point. Vazquez is a couple years younger. There's still more prospect pedigree with him. It is an upgrade on the fringes of the roster. I know we're not talking about a giant upgrade who's going to hit in the middle of the Orioles order in 2025, but these are things that good teams do. You see the Rays, the Dodgers, the Guardians, all these different teams across the board. Yes, they upgrade in the big parts of the roster, but they also upgrade on the fringes. And Luis Vazquez over Emanuel Rivera is the Orioles upgrading on the fringes of the roster, improving their depth because their lack of depth hurt them with all the injuries they suffered in the second half last year. This is something that should help them moving forward. Now, you may be surprised by the Orioles taking Rivera off the roster because of how good he was for the Orioles last season. Emanuel Rivera, 28 years old, had bounced around with a couple teams, the Royals and the Diamondbacks and the Marlins, and he'd always been a glove-first infielder, but had never really hit at the big league level at all. And he was DFA'd by the Marlins last year, and the Orioles were dealing with Jordan Westburg injury and Ramon Urias injury and slumping at the plate, and they just needed some right-handed hitters who could play the infield. And they went and got Rivera, who was hitting .214 with a 60 WRC plus with the Marlins. He joins the Orioles, and now he's not an everyday player, but in 27 games and 73 plate appearances down the stretch for the Orioles, Rivera, just for the first time in his career at the big league level, starts hitting. 313, 370, 578 slash line, 4 home runs. It was a 166 WRC plus in those 73 plate appearances. And if you knock down the parameters and say, hey, minimum 70 plate appearances down the stretch, he was the Orioles' best hitter after the moment that they claimed him. Now, again, he wasn't playing every single day, and the O's were trying to put him in good matchups, but Rivera made the postseason roster. He got an at-bat off the bench as a pinch hitter in game 1 of that wild card series against the Royals. Like, he really helped out the O's at times when he was on the field, playing third base, playing first base. But even with that, like, he's never hit at any other time in his career. And you're not going to take a 27-game sample size for a guy that's played 341 and has over 1,000 big league plate appearances with an 87 career WRC plus. You're not going to take those 73, even if the Orioles did make tweaks with him, which I'm sure they did when he got to Baltimore, and think this is Rivera. And that's why I thought earlier in the offseason, when Rivera was arbitration eligible, I was like, hey, he's only going to get 1 point something million, but I just figured he was an easy non-tender candidate. The Orioles were just going to kind of cut him loose, get him back to free agency, knowing that you look around a healthy Orioles infield, there was just no space for Emanuel Rivera. And if there really was, it'd be him versus Kobe Mayo for a roster spot. It's like, wouldn't you rather just roster one of your top prospects, maybe your tippy top prospect and Kobe Mayo instead of Emanuel Rivera? So I didn't think he'd make it this far in the offseason, but he did. And at this point, the Orioles finally kind of pulled the plug, even though they did tender him a contract to pay him $1 million for 2025. I mentioned it when the O's made that decision back in November or December. That didn't necessarily mean Rivera would still stick around for the entire offseason. And that comment kind of bears fruit at this point with the Orioles making that move. Now, if another team claims him, they would have to pay him the $1 million that the Orioles guaranteed him via tendering him a contract. And this is why, even with Rivera now on waivers, it makes him more likely actually to stay with the team that the Orioles did give him that $1 million in ARB. Because if a team claims him, again, they have to pay him $1 million. And maybe a team that is looking to get Rivera, a rebuilding team, try to just add an interesting bat, is not willing to pay that guaranteed $1 million for a guy who is out of options as well. And if he does clear waivers, he actually, at this point in his career, has the right to decline an assignment to AAA. If he clears waivers, he can just say, I don't want to stay with the Orioles. I want to become a free agent. But the thing is, if he declines his outright assignment and says, I want to be a free agent, he is no longer guaranteed that $1 million. And instead, he would go to free agency. Someone would probably sign him to a minor league contract with a spring training invite, but he's going to make not $1 million next year. So, and still, there's not a lot of teams that are going to guarantee him playing time at the big league level. So if you're Rivera and you already had success with the Orioles last year, and they're going to give you $1 million if you stick around, if he clears waivers, he's probably going to opt to just stay in the organization in AAA and get that $1 million. So I think the Orioles' thought process here was, hey, we're going to DFA him. We still like him as depth, but there's a good chance because of those factors, he would still stick in the organization because A, less likely someone claims him, and B, if no one does, he has a reason to want to stick around in AAA Norfolk. And listen, like, even so, the DFA, this move for Rivera was kind of always coming. You're looking at the other hitters on this roster. Even if Jorge Mateo, because of the elbow surgery, does have to start the season on the injured list, and it kind of opens up another spot, that's probably filled by Dylan Carlson, who the Orioles just brought in last week. And if there's another infield injury, you could easily see the Orioles giving the spot to Kobe Mayo, or even someone like Luis Vazquez, who they clearly like a little bit better, bringing him in this week. So with Rivera out of options, at worst, he was going to be DFA'd on opening day when he did not make the roster. And more likely, as what happened, it was going to come up at some point this offseason. Luis Vazquez has more upside. He's got minor league options. It just makes him a better fit on the 40-man than Rivera. But the Orioles would love Emanuel Rivera, I think, to stick around, be spring training depth, and, hey, still be around if the O's would need him at the big league level at some point this season. But speaking of those infielders, I already talked about Jorge Mateo. Still kind of a question about him, whether or not he'll be ready for opening day. But I think the bigger question is, what's his future with the Orioles? We got a little bit of further information about what that could be with some news last week. We'll talk about that to finish off the pod coming up next. So we finish things out today with Jorge Mateo, who has had an interesting offseason. Mateo, last season, after a terrible 2023, got his bat together a little bit more, still just a 87 WRC plus, still hit just 229. He was still a below average major league hitter in the 208 plate appearances he had, 68 games as kind of a bench player for the Orioles last year. But he had that gruesome elbow injury in August, got surgery, missed the remainder of the year. And Mike Elias, when talking about it in this offseason, has kind of been non-committal about the status of the injury. All we know for sure is that Mateo will be participating in spring training in some form or fashion in Sarasota. But Elias has not said anything like, hey, we expect Mateo to be ready for opening day. It sounds like there's a good chance Mateo will begin the year on the injured list. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to miss half the season, but if you read between the lines, it feels like, hey, he could miss a couple of weeks up to maybe the entire month of April as he still recovers back from that elbow surgery that he got. So what that means is, hey, there's an open spot on the roster. And with the Orioles signing Dylan Carlson to a major league deal last week, we talked about he could fill it. Maybe Kobe Mayo could fill it. Maybe a guy like Luis Vazquez, who we already talked about, could fill that role. But when I chatted about Dylan Carlson last week, I talked about how, if the O's are going to keep Mateo, it's because they think he can also play the outfield. Remember, the Orioles played him for 20 innings in center field at the big league level last year, and they think if he's so versatile, he can bring the speed, he can hit lefties, and he can play the infield and the outfield. That'll cause them to keep him around. If they don't think he can play the outfield, well, he's set to be a free agent after this season. Dylan Carlson, be a little bit cheaper, younger, higher upside. I felt like Carlson might be taking Mateo's spot on the bench. And Mateo, at that point, he'd been tendered a contract, but he was the only arbitration-eligible player the Orioles had not agreed to a salary figure on for 2025, which was set to be his final year before free agency. Well, the news broke last week that the Orioles had come to an agreement with Mateo, kind of avoiding that third-party arbitration process. And Mateo will make $3.55 million for the 2025 season. That wasn't very much news. The bigger news was that with that agreement, the Orioles also tacked on a club option for Mateo that would, if it's picked up, pay him $5.5 million for the 2026 season. So a club option means that at the end of this year, the Orioles can decide to pick up that club option in which they would bring back Mateo for an extra year in 2026, pay him $5.5 million, or they can decline the option, which would then send him into free agency after this upcoming season. But when he didn't have that option, he was going to be a free agent this year either way. Now with the Orioles putting on that club option, it does make you think a little bit more like, hey, they're at least considering having Mateo on this roster beyond 2025, where I felt like before that, it was kind of going to be, hey, either way, this is going to be his last year in Baltimore. Now, some of the adding the club option, the Orioles have done this with guys like Danny Coulombe and Ryan O'Hearn and Cionel Perez and others in arbitration just in the past couple of years. It's something that I think Mike Elias likes to do. It's also a way to just give another point towards the player and get him to agree to a number in arbitration. It could have been a situation where, the Orioles wanted to pay him 3.5. Mateo wanted $4 million. The Orioles said, if you'll take the 3.5, we'll tack on a club option for more money next year, where potentially, if you play well, you could have guaranteed money for 2026. And that is enticing enough for a player to maybe agree on that lower 3.5 instead of the maybe closer to $4 million that Mateo wanted for next year. So a lot of it is a bargaining chip that the Orioles were putting out there. They could still have no plans of bringing him back and just decline the option after the year and make him a free agent. But it does leave the door just cracked a little bit open for him to come back. Now, I still stand by what I said last week. Dylan Carlson could spell the end for Jorge Mateo. I really doubt the Orioles would bring back Mateo for almost $6 million just to be a pinch runner and a defensive replacement, unless he really shows he can play the outfield or turns it on more with the bat this season. I don't see them picking up that option. Like the player he was last year, 87 WRC plus, elite speed, good glove, can potentially play the infield and the outfield. Like that's still a fine player to have on your roster. He still did post a 127 WRC plus against left-handed pitching last year. That is always nice to have. But if Mateo really is not able to add the outfield glove truly to his tool belt, like, yeah, the Orioles trusted him enough to start him out there a couple of times last year, but he's got to show us more until we feel like, okay, he can really play the outfield. If he can't add that to the tool belt, I think he's getting pushed out of this infield. Like as long as we see that Jackson Holliday's ready to go and be the everyday second baseman, and then eventually this year, Kobe Mayo is ready to be some sort of third base, first base, DH combination in the Orioles infield, like they think he will be at some point in 2025, then with what he showed last year, Ramon Arias has secured his spot as the Orioles utility guy, at least for another year. He's above Mateo in the pecking order as well, at least in my opinion. At that point, Mateo's just getting pushed out of the infield. If he can play the outfield, that's how he keeps his roster spot. But if he's a little shaky out there in center, there's just not enough infield spots to go around. You got to have another outfielder instead, which is why I've talked about, I think Carlson is kind of pushing him. Now, with Mateo TBD for opening day, I do think they'll be cautious with it, and I think it's more likely that he does start the season on the injured list, so the Orioles can kind of kick this decision down the road a little bit. And then I do think, honestly, even if Dylan Carlson does go on the roster with Mateo on the IL, I think Mateo would get his roster spot back when he returned in, say, May, and the Orioles would maybe just option Dylan Carlson down to AAA because he does have those minor league options. But at some point this year, he's got to prove something either with the bat or defensively in the outfield to get that option picked up for 2026. I just don't really see it happening. I don't see a spot where Mateo gets a bigger role this year. Arias showed he can hit lefties better. Obviously, Holliday, I think, is going to get into his groove. You have Kobe Mayo as a potential lefty masher ready to go. More at bats for Kjerstad. You've brought in Carlson. Just all the things around it are coming down to Mateo and just showing, is it that worth it to keep a guy around just because he's got elite speed as a good pinch runner and can maybe play multiple positions? Like, even though he can hit lefties, there's just other guys with higher upside who can do it. I just don't know. Almost $6 million for that kind of player, even with David Rubenstein in charge, is something the O's would want to do. I love Mateo. He could still certainly impact the 2025 Orioles. I'm just not sure if it comes up beyond that for him, but there is still now that club option the Orioles have in their bag when they added that with the agreement with Jorge Mateo. That'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. And of course, wherever you are listening, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify, subscribe over there, leave a 5-star rating and a review. It really helps out the show. We will be back on Tuesday with another episode, looking to go live and jump back into the mailbag. Haven't done a mailbag episode in a while, but the plan is for Tuesday evening. That's Tuesday, February 4th at 8 p.m. Eastern time. We're going to be live right here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, answering your Orioles mailbag questions. So make sure to join us live. You can put your questions in the chat, or if you can't join live, you can email me, lockedonorioles@gmail.com, with those mailbag questions, and we'll try to get to them on the episode. We'll certainly talk about the possibility of the Orioles trading for maybe not Dylan Cease, but maybe Michael King as a starting pitcher from the San Diego Padres, and get to a lot more Orioles offseason questions as we head towards spring training and as momentum builds a little bit more towards the season. We're starting to think about potentially a Locked On Orioles fantasy baseball league. This is in the very infant stages, but let me know in the comments here or shoot me an email, lockedonorioles@gmail.com, if that's something as a Locked On Orioles listener you'd be interested in, playing a fantasy baseball league with me and other listeners of the show. It's maybe something I'll get started if there is some interest out there. So just let me know. Again, we'll be back on Tuesday with a live mailbag episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.